All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Glad to have you here. I know it's a long time no see. I'm here with James Ballard. And James, I first heard of him from the Rethinking Faith YouTube channel and podcast. He actually is one of the, I don't know if you call yourself a co-host, a guest, whatever, but you're on there pretty regularly. And then James also has a website. It's called The Hidden Orchard. And then we're going to also be talking about his book, Into the Orchard, which is based, similar name, right? I'm sure we're going to be talking about the orchard here in this live stream, but specifically, we're going to be focused on Midrashic tradition in the New Testament, because this is something that I feel like you really can't understand the New Testament fully unless you understand the idea of Midrashim and Jewish oral tradition. So anyway, before we get into it, I'd love if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your faith journey and who you are.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. It's exciting. And I know we were talking about this before, but we had almost connected. Was it November of last year? So I'm thankful that you remembered to keep this on the calendar. My story is kind of a mess. I don't think it's unique, but it started off, my mom's family came from Germany, Poland, around the time of the Holocaust. The map changed a little bit. What was Poland became Germany and then back. Our family came from that mess in Berlin. They were Jewish refugees, if you will. They came to Baltimore, Maryland, and they set up shop. And very few people wanted anything to do with religion at that point. So I kind of grew up in this weird nebulous space of my mom was traditionally from a Jewish family, but not very religious at all, but proud of being Jewish, if that makes any sense. And then my dad was Catholic. He was not Jewish. So I kind of grew up in between those worlds. I spent my teens and 20s kind of just exploring Eastern religion, Eastern faith. Found a lot of what wasn't in the Catholic Church. I found that in the Eastern world. And what I benefited from in the Catholic world was just the majesty of it all, the tradition, kind of the routine and ritual. I really appreciated that. Later, I would come to Protestant church. After my teens and 20s, I kind of crashed and burned, living a different life, and landed in the Protestant church. And it was a good place for me at the time. I really got a chance to reconnect with Hashem and understand where I misunderstood and kind of have a fresh start. But then it wasn't long before I really got involved in studying, and that persistent question about our Jewish heritage just kept coming into the picture. I started studying. I found a rabbi who was really gracious enough to answer all my questions, my thousands of questions. Went to a seminary, and while I was on staff at that Protestant church, learning, the mega church beliefs and kind of the seminary and all of the teaching that comes with that, I had this concurrent path of studying kind of the Jewish roots of all of this. And it was a trip to Israel. I went with my mom to Israel, and that just blew the lid off of it. I was just weird after that. I came back and I just didn't fit in anymore. And I was pretty vocal about what I was learning. I hadn't quite learned that that would not be the right way to talk people into what you were finding. So, eventually I left the church after about 2 years on staff. I left, and it was weird, right? I think a lot of people can relate when you make that transition, no matter who you are, Jew, Gentile, whatever, you just don't fit in the mainstream offerings, right? You don't fit in churches, and sometimes you don't necessarily fit in what's available in the Jewish world either, Reform synagogues or whatever. So I struggled with that for a while, but it's been a really good journey. I wouldn't change a bit of it. It was definitely weird for a while. I think we've kind of landed on our feet and kind of understand who we are. My family and I, we understand kind of who we are and what we're doing. But this space, as you know, it's weird space, right? It's you have to kind of tread lightly, and you have to find your inner core of people who kind of get it and get you and are open-minded. And that's been my faith journey so far. And I find that now as a Torah pursuant Jew, I'm finding that a lot of what I was missing, what I thought was not in what we call the Bible, is actually part of the Jewish tradition. You just have to dig for it a little bit. And I want to say that now because it'll come back up probably later at some point. Midrash is kind of the gateway to that in a very strange way. And I think I'll make that connection later.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. It is very like fragile ground. A lot of us are on here because it's easy to swing to the extreme for better or for
Yeah.
worse. So yeah, thanks for sharing a little bit about your journey. So what inspired you to start writing about like Midrashim, general Jewish concepts, especially in light of the New Testament? I know you have a book, you have the website, and then you also, of course, do stuff, like I said, on rethinking faith. But what inspired that?
Yeah, so I think just your truth-seeking listeners will probably relate. Some people are just hardwired to ask the questions you may not be ready for the answers for, right? And I kind of have that mentality, just sort of I see things a little bit differently. I think there's something I'm missing here. And I dug in, and through yeshiva and through the questions I was asking this rabbi, and just sources online and podcasts and thousands of hours of podcasts and reading, I couldn't help but realize two things. Number one, the hermeneutics process of how Jews approach the Bible is dramatically different than anything I had learned in the Catholic or the Protestant church, right? Um, there's the fourfold PaRDeS, and this is what the orchard, that's kind of what the website and the book are centered around. It's a very different system. It's fundamentally different in how you look at the multifaceted nature of even just the Hebrew text. And I couldn't help but notice over the years, there is so much midrash that is connected to the teachings in the New Testament. And I would find very often the more difficult, troubling passages could be answered and resolved if you were aware of the midrash that that particular writer was leveraging. I'm sure you've seen that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I've noticed that a lot of the difficult issues that we deal with, the inevitable stuff that the anti-missionaries bring up, if you were familiar with Midrash, if you were familiar with the way that rabbis write, the way that the Hebrew mind works, a lot of that stuff is answered. That's the explanation for the confusing things about the New Testament.
Yeah.
So could you explain what a Midrash is? What is this whole idea for those that don't know?
Yeah, so the four ways of looking at scripture, PaRDeS, it's an acronym for Peshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. Peshat is your plain meaning. So I think when people open up an English Bible, they're mostly reading a translation of the literal plain meaning, right? And the Jewish world doesn't stop there, right? If you, I think I said this in the book. If not, I'll repeat it. A kosher Torah scroll doesn't have vowels, which
Right.
means any word can mean multiple different things. And how you land on a plain translation is, and I'm going to drop this now, but we'll talk about it later, part of the oral tradition. So even just fundamental to a translation of the Bible is reliant on the Jewish oral tradition. And the next level up from that, okay, so there's the plain meaning. The people crossed, or Israel, they crossed through the sea and they went to the other side and the water parted.
Mm-hmm.
Now the next level would be drash or drush, or however people say it. And that's where a midrash comes from. It's like a homiletic teaching. It's a sermon. It's what you would hear and do here in the synagogue. And I'm sure you see that at Beth Emanuel every weekend. It's how that plain text becomes relevant in your life today. Mm-hmm. It's not very different from what a pastor will give in a church, a sermon. Mm-hmm. But in the Jewish world, there's a framework to that. Mm-hmm. And often there's thousands of years of these sermons, if you will, that are well known and people pull from them. They're not every week making up entirely new traditions. Sometimes people do, but there's a really deep, rich tradition of that. And I find that the New Testament plays in the space of drash all the way up to the mystical. Mm-hmm. And if you're aware of how those work, it dramatically changes. It changes everything. I mean, there's really no end to how much it can change. It can really wreck people too. I remember when I first started learning about Midrash, the rabbi I was learning with continually had to push me back into the framework, because you just want to. I like that version better than this one, right? Mm-hmm. I like the drash better than the peshat, and you can't do that. They're all part of the fabric. But one thing, I remember, I think you might have had a discussion, or we may have discussed at some point, some of these anti-missionaries, right? They'll take a verse that a Christian will use and say, oh, this verse is talking about Messiah. And they'll say, no, it's not. It's talking about name somebody, right? And in a sense, it's like a sleight of hand move. They're right in the Peshat, but in the Sod, right, there's a whole world, and in the Midrashic level, there's a whole world of interpretation that might strike very close to what the Christian is seeing. But you have to kind of know that they exist to know the difference and when to apply them and what the rules are. And I find a lot of what I experienced in the church, people aren't aware that these levels exist, and they kind of mash everything into one literal level. So Messiah is, Isaiah is talking about Messiah, and that's Messiah. And it's like, well, no, on what level are you talking about? Because there are different ways of reading it. So it really causes trouble, in my opinion, in my experience, for people to make that bridge, to understand that, oh, wait, there's a different way to read this, and you have to know when it's using the Sod or the Midrash or the Remez or the Peshat.
Right, yeah. I feel like when I understood that concept, at least starting with the Gospel of Matthew, that's the first book of the New Testament, and starting there, that was actually understanding that you don't always have to read things as a Peshat, that you can go a little deeper. That actually was the first thing that really put me at peace at reading the New Testament, because a lot of that stuff, like immediately when you start out the Gospel of Matthew, you start seeing things, or like Matthew pulls passages from the Old Testament in the Peshat refers to someone else, but that's completely kosher. It's a completely kosher way of communicating something to your audience. It's not wrong. It's not manipulative or anything like that. But do you have any favorite examples of Midrashim from the New Testament? Any examples, maybe in the Gospels, and then also maybe in like Paul's letters, anything like that?
I do, and there's really no end to these. I'm almost considering putting together another book, because I really left a lot of the more scandalous or the controversial ones out, because I didn't want the first book to just turn people off any more than it was already going to. But one of my favorite ones, because it really highlights how things can go badly when you don't understand this, is the famous passage where Yeshua says, not a letter of the Torah will be removed, right? Until heaven and earth pass away. And when you look at that, he's very clearly telling everyone, do not reinterpret the Torah. Do not, you'll be the least in the kingdom if you teach anyone even think about it, right? I mean, it's a really very clear command not to think about removing a letter. And if you do, here's the punishment for it. And not until everything is fulfilled. And what he did there is he actually strung together a few midrash. And I like that one because for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very clear when you read the midrash about Solomon, who did. Solomon removed, and I have this in the book, and I think it's on the website as well. Solomon removed the yod, which is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right? Inconsequential, right? It's the smallest one, not a big deal. But it reverses the meaning of that word to the opposite of what Hashem said.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And it's when you see a lot of people, and I've been in these seminars, I've been in these conferences when I was in the church, the spiritual formation pastor, the people who are in charge of what gets taught and what doesn't, say Jesus very clearly said the Torah has been done away with because he fulfilled it. And when you read the Midrash, he very clearly said the opposite.
Right.
But it's only clear because you didn't understand that he was leveraging rabbinic teachings. And if you remember, it says it in the Gospels, he sat at the feet of the sages and he asked questions, and they were amazed at what he came up with as well. But he sat at their feet. He learned from them. So that's just one. But if I can take a second, I think the best modern example, if anyone's still struggling with this, and I've said this in almost every opportunity I get, it's like a movie quote. So if you grew up knowing movies, watching movies, there's probably a line in a movie, usually a comedy, that you know and your friends know because you saw the movie. And if you were to say that line to your friend, you actually create a lot more content in their mind than just that sentence alone would bring, right? If I say, I have a bad feeling about this, right? It's the Star Wars.
We all know what it means. Yeah.
Right. All those movies, Han Solo, right? All these people come into your mind, and you realize the usage in the context. But if you have never seen that, someone will say, "What do you mean you have a bad feeling about this?" Right? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. No information is important, and that's how Jewish audiences who may not have really even, I mean, some may not have even been able to really read all that well, but they knew these by heart. They knew these, they were memorized, at least to a large degree. And these Midrashim were very prolific as well. So somebody, a good teacher, a traveling rabbi, could use a Midrash that he knows the audience understands, and he could carry his message and connect with them through one line. And it happens all the time. It's like word flagging in the Torah. So all that to say that there are so many of them. You know, in the one example, Paul, somewhere in Timothy, Paul quotes, or he uses a story of Jannes and Jambres and how they opposed Moses. They're nowhere to be found in any of the Bible, depending on what your canon is, right? Because the canons differ from Protestant to Catholic or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're not in there. So what is he talking about? And how did his audience then understand what he was talking about? And what I find fascinating, if you've made this connection, he's often talking to Gentiles when he's using these midrash, Paul, in Paul's case. And they seem to know. There doesn't seem to be a need to explain the midrash. So you could almost make the case that they're learning these every weekend in the Shabbat, in the synagogue,
right,
along with the Jewish people. So I think even the original audience that Paul spoke with had a much more profound and rich knowledge of this Jewish tradition. And the oral tradition is where the Midrash comes from. It's now written in some form, and you can find a lot of it written. But it seemed like they understood this in their time more than we do today. The church has kind of moved out of the oral tradition, and therefore anything that's not accepted and within sola scriptura in some cases, or within the canon in others, is left by the wayside.
Right. Yeah. Why do you think that a lot of Protestant denominations, and then also even those who were Protestant and now coming to a more like a Messianic or Hebrew roots perspective, like why do you think people are so against the idea of oral tradition and all of that?
Yeah, and in some cases they really are, right? I mean, I've been called all the names you can be called for venturing outside of the Bible's doctrine. I think fundamentally it's about control and convenience. I think very early on, without the Jewish people being part of those congregations after the Jewish people were exiled from Rome, and fast forward to Nicaea, the Nicene Council, things were very rapidly in the centuries after the apostles died, moving in different directions. I know Daniel Lancaster does a great job. I can't find it anymore. I was looking for it to send someone the other day. It's the teaching of the parting of the ways. Very fascinating. If anyone's interested in this, look it up. It's worthwhile. It's worth every minute of it. But the parting of the ways really began the peeling away of the Jewish and the Gentile people from the same congregation. And I think it got off the rails very early. I mean, the early councils, you see the church needs to establish order. They had really little idea what to do with the Holy Spirit and some of these Jewish holidays, and they land on different Roman holidays. So we need to find out how we're going to do Passover, right? Some of the church fathers started to say, hey, we shouldn't be doing Passover. And some said, oh, we should be. So I think the doctrine that has developed has been about control and kind of creating a shared reality by that shared norms, customs, orthodoxy and heresy, creating standards that all these different people throughout the Roman diaspora and in Europe and wherever could come together and have something to unite on. But I think the reality of it is it created a very different context and a very different presupposition from how you would interact with the Bible and Scripture, and even what is Scripture, from a very early time. And I think one of the examples I've observed over the history of my life has been so many denominations of the church. And there are probably a lot of denominations that aren't classified as denominations as well that spun off, because fundamentally, when you make the decision not to import an oral tradition, you have done so with your own oral tradition. That's a tradition. It's not neutral, right? So our tradition is we don't use that tradition. Well, congrats, you have just signed yourself up to come up with your own over time, because it's going to happen. The Bible has gaps in it. There are things that are meant to be imported and transferred orally, and it's a framework. The Torah is a framework of how to navigate life. Facebook's not in the Bible. How much time to spend on TikTok's not in the Bible, right? The framework will help you with that. So I think the church has suffered, unfortunately, from not having accepted that oral tradition. And I think because of that, they've created their own, and downstream from that is a fear often of creating any new doctrines or new allowances, right? It's very troubling when you've kind of moved into that space. You have to kind of guard what you have built.
Right. Yeah. And I think a good example, for better or for worse, of a denomination of a sort that's actually preserved itself very well is actually Catholic and Orthodox churches, both of which hold a heavy emphasis on oral tradition, on authority that's passed down through the generations. And those are the two, I don't know if I can call them denominations, but the two branches of Christianity that have actually pretty much survived, maybe 1600 years, 1700 years, something like that. They have actually pretty much survived unchanged. And you would say that's probably largely to the idea of tradition in a way, some amount of authority.
Absolutely. And you just brought up a really good point, that the problem the problem we're talking about is a Western one, because Eastern has preserved an oral tradition. And in many cases, they're very respectful of the Jewish tradition. I think their calendar is very close. I mean, someone sent me a video once in just disbelief of, I think it was an Armenian church. It looked like a synagogue. I almost had no idea what I was watching. I had to ask, what is this?
Yeah.
You know? And the reality is we kind of look from our worldview out. So our modern Western worldview is the right one. That's the assumption, and everything outside of it is wrong. But I think that that's why we struggle with these emphases on tradition or no tradition. But the reality is Catholic Church very early on created one, and they've maintained, right? I mean, look, they haven't had to create a new one every time they turned a page and disagreed on something. So you can say on some level, these traditions are valuable.
Right. Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in your book, you actually said that oral tradition in a way is almost vital to your understanding of the Bible. Could you explain that a little bit? Because I think that's almost hard for people to believe, again, especially if you come from a Protestant background.
Yeah. So I think number one, we kind of covered that in the Exodus 18 and Leviticus 26, there are just a few examples of when Torah were given. Multiple are given. And Judaism has maintained, with the exception of groups like the Karaites or the Sadducees, Judaism has largely maintained and agreed on part of the Torahs, the two given, one is written, one's oral. That's because there are things like, just grammar, right? We covered the interpretation, but even grammar. There's a famous Gemara in the story in the Talmud. Rabbi Hillel and Shammai are talking to a Gentile. He wants to know just the written, not the oral. Just teach me the written one. I don't want to know about the oral one, right? Someone would ask that same question today, I'm sure. And he says they're both one and the same, right? There are many versions of this, but how you translate the words. Why does the word mean this and not that, right? What is the difference? It's a tradition. Ambiguities, like how do you observe Shabbat? It really doesn't tell you. How do you separate from the good fat, from the fat and the other parts of the animal, right? You would have to have somebody teach you how to sacrifice an animal. Certain things can be offered, certain things can't. The Bible doesn't go into that level of detail. Historical events, cultural contexts, astronomy. If you're going to keep track of when Passover starts, coming up soon, you have to have kind of a working understanding of when a new moon starts or when the Shabbat start, when do these seasons come and go. God told us to keep track of them for the sake of tracking time and keeping track of time. So you have to have a lot more information and knowledge than you think to really be observant. Circumcision, I remember circumcision is not very specific as to what exactly you're cutting away. That is part of the tradition. Certain birds you can eat, certain birds you can't. And the words aren't very clear, but thankfully we have a tradition that goes with it. And it kind of reminds me of, I forget the name of the book. It was so long ago. There was a pastor who very respectfully, I think, went into this challenge of trying to observe all the Bible's laws for 1 year. And he went out, it's kind of funny. It's more comical than anything, but you kind of cringe a little bit because he's trying to do this from the literal, right? Like he even jokes about how he would have to stone somebody that's committing adultery. Like, obviously, that's not how the sages handled things. There's a lot more leeway and mercy in the Torah, but he was going after it in a way that was very hyper literal, and it made me laugh to a degree because that's kind of the error when you don't accept an oral tradition. Yes, the Bible becomes very antiquated and almost impossible to keep the Torah, but the oral tradition bridges that gap. It's that hashkafa, that worldview that helps make it practical and relevant.
Right. The actual, like the passage about an eye for an eye, that's actually a really good example of if you read it for the plain meaning, you would probably come up with some crazy ideas. But the rabbis have always understood that as being, that you give an equal value of that eye, whatever that they're compensated for something like that if you injure someone.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point as well, because these are not in the plain sense of what we would call the plain sense, right? If you read the English Standard Version, it doesn't say anything about that. But the Jewish tradition is a result of poring over those texts, reading these words very deeply, using incredible logic, right? They didn't have distractions like movies and all the things that kind of pull us away today. And they found in their wisdom amazing insights that they can justify these things. They can show you why God wants us to have mercy. One example is God says, leave me, Moses, and I'll destroy these people. And Moses kind of filibusters him for a while until he doesn't destroy the people, right? So God said he's going to destroy him, but he didn't. Because why? Because Moses stalled, and there was an exchange, and mercy was granted. And the sages find these things everywhere. And this example I like to come back to is very plain in the New Testament. So why didn't Paul, if everything's in the Bible, sola scriptura? I know that's not on the table. I'm just going to throw that in here for the moment. If everything's in the Bible, which was at that time not even including New Testament texts, why couldn't he solve the problem of how to bring Gentiles into the synagogue? Why were there so many letters written back and forth from these communities in Corinth to Paul and then him back to them? Why did he then have to go back to the leadership of the Jerusalem Council? Why did they have to debate it? If it's all in there, no need for a tradition, then the New Testament would have been one book, right? One letter. It would have been simple, but it wasn't, because the rabbinic process is dynamic. It changes as contexts change, geographic regions, right? The New Testament is actually a perfect example of the oral tradition or the rabbinic tradition in action.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. There's even times that you'll see that where Paul says, I marvel that you've, or I forget how it goes, but he talks about how you've kept the tradition as it's passed down to you. And then that's like in 1 Corinthians 11, I think, where it talks about head coverings, which we know is not even in the Old Testament at all. It's not, and that just comes up. So he even sort of commends them for keeping a tradition. And then I think of also where Yeshua says about, being like the angels, you don't know the scriptures. You were, you won't be given in marriage just like the angels. I'm kind of paraphrasing, and I had COVID, so my brain's not all there. But you know what I'm talking about. There's sometimes where they reference something that's not even in the written text, and you kind of wonder where that comes from. And I guess for a lot of Christians, there might be some concern on the liberties that a lot of these people, like New Testament authors, take when they're referring to that. Could you give some encouragement for people to not be concerned? If you're coming to this newly, it can be a little overwhelming, I think. So what would you say to someone?
Well, it's a challenge, right? I mean, it's years and years of journeying. And I'll just make a shameless plug. This is what I'm working on my website. I'm really trying to bring content and sources to help bridge that gap,
Hmm.
because a lot of times people, you don't start from a neutral place when you ask these questions. I remember, because I grew up in the Catholic Church, I grew up in American culture, where you have the threat of eternal punishment over your head
Hmm.
if you get one of these things wrong. And I remember I would read something and it was incredibly logical, and wow, I feel like that's the truth here, even though that my pastor says that I'm probably going to lose my job now. Um, am I going to go to hell? I don't know. We'll see, but I think this is where I need to go. And I think people actually, they come to that kind of precipice when they're studying outside of their tradition, because that's what we've been trained. That's what we've been told. We're way downstream from these um, eras where you could be killed for asking the questions we ask today. Ray and Mitch and I would joke all the time on Rethinking Faith, which, by the way, I kind of invited myself onto at some point. I don't know how we did that, but we laugh because these questions would be our execution a few hundred years ago. So I think some of those fears still exist. Ostracized from your group, maybe you're removed from staff. So I think just know that God can handle it, right? Hashem is big. He can handle all the mess. He can handle our questions. We were given minds to ask questions. I think it's far more problematic to not ask questions and follow truth where it leads you than it is to ask a question that rattles your theology for a couple weeks, right? But there are a lot of people out there. You can find groups online. I think it's a slow process. The rabbi I first met with, who helped me along, he said, there's no shortcut. And as much as I wanted there to be a shortcut, there is no shortcut. I can tell you that the learning is a lifelong endeavor. And what all of us know today will be nothing compared to what we know in a month. And I think that's just the nature of it. So just move into that new paradigm, be bold, research, dig up, find some good sources, step outside of your comfort zone, find some good um, normal Jewish podcasts. Maybe they'll have a different insight, different take, and just kind of learn to let people have their boundaries. And I say that because, like, I don't, and I say this in the book, I'm not trying to convert anyone to anything. I don't want Jews to come to the church or Messianic Judaism. If they're fine where they are, wonderful. I don't want Christians to convert and move into Judaism, right? I think that's terrible for some people. I think that's actually absolutely, that'll be devastating for them, their family, if they do these, because these aren't necessarily where we're supposed to be. I think let people also be very angry and have their boundaries with things you want to teach them. I remember the first time I was asked to teach a drosh or um, give a drosh at a Messianic synagogue back in Maryland. Two people left that day.
Hmm.
I crossed a line somewhere and they left. And I don't know if they went back. It's been years. But I mean, I don't know if there's anything I could have done with that. But over the years, I have been more careful. I don't knock pillars down unless I have the time or the person's interested in engaging and we have the time to rebuild them correctly.
Right.
So I would say just anyone who's out there and you're kind of towing that line, maybe you're already over the line, be bold. You'll find your way. God's there.
Yeah, that's one thing I really enjoyed about your book is where you opened up and kind of was like, I'm going to just share this with you. This is just information. Take it or leave it. You do what you want with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to change anyone's mind because this is, like I said, really shaky ground sometimes. And I've seen both extremes where people are just apathetic to this kind of information. But I've also seen people who beat you over the head with it too. So you have to be really careful with all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you brought up a couple of examples of Midrash in the New Testament that you really like. I was wondering if you could share about the tearing of the veil, that one in Hebrews, kind of putting you on the spot because I didn't give you that in the questions before, but could you share that one?
Yeah. So the tearing of the veil is a really fascinating one because everywhere I heard this growing up, the tearing of the veil, I can't get both of my hands in here. I don't know where the camera is. The veil um, is based on the idea that God has opened the way to everybody. Right now, everybody can approach God. Um, Also, that's one step away from replacement theology, and in fact, it is the gateway to replacement theology, because the veil has been torn, and now the nations are God's people. And I've even heard someone say that he tore the veil like somebody rends a garment, because he got rid of his people, right? Like he got rid of one group of people and he took in another. Problematic is an understatement, because there are two veils. And I don't take that as, like, and I'll just say this might be controversial. I don't take that as necessarily like a historical account. And that's the other thing. When you read the Midrash, you start to realize, oh, whoa, this New Testament is like, things happened. Maybe they didn't happen exactly as it's written. And that's why every gospel has a different spin on it, or different details, because they have a different kind of part of the tradition that they're aiming to land it within. You know what I mean? Genealogies are different. Why? Not because they didn't know. I think they knew. They have different messages they're trying to give you. So the veil that the centurion would have seen from the top of the mountain would have been the outer veil, because that covered the outside of the temple. And inside the temple was the veil to the Holy of Holies. And that's the one people think is usually torn, because they're not aware that there was an outer veil. On that outer veil, the word that he's using is it was like torn, right? It's a very specific word for torn in the Greek. It's the veil has the heavens and the earth embroidered on it. And what's fascinating about that is the temple is designed to mirror the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden in the Jewish tradition contains everything. It contains all of creation, right? It was kind of this like mix of physical and ethereal. We don't know what that looks like today, because we're downstream from that collapse. Okay, so the veil was torn. The stars in the heavens were torn. Interesting. If you go back to when Yeshua was in the Jordan, which, following Jewish tradition, when the person who reaches the level of Mashiach, or reaches this level, is ready to kind of start their mission, if you will, the Spirit is given to them. And you'll find this in like the Zohar and sources like that. So we're dealing with the Sod level, the mystical level. It uses that same word. And it says the heavens and the earth were torn, right, as the dove descended. And this is important because Jewish cosmology, there are veils between these different worlds. So the physical world, the heavens and the earth, are separated from the next world up by a veil. And the sages talk about how long it takes to cross that veil. It's a big veil, right? It's like it's this divider, and so on and so forth. It cascades out. It looks a lot like Mark was, and in the Gospels, they're showing that something entered through the veil, the heavens and the earth, ripped the heavens and the earth, came in, did some kind of a transformative work, and then upon Jesus' death, exited through the heavens and the earth, the outer veil, which was that Babylonian tapestry. And I have this on my website as well in a more condensed version. So what you're seeing is not replacement theology. You're not seeing a replacement of a people or the dismantling of the temple, which some people have come to that conclusion as well. Oh, the temple is no longer needed anymore. All that temple stuff, right? It's bad. We don't need that. What you're seeing is the gospel writers trying to say something mystical, cosmological just came in and radically transformed our condition, and then it left back through the veil. And if you look at some of the prophecies, you'll see that. Haggai talks about that. In a very short book of Haggai, he talks about the heavens and the earth being rent, right? And the glory of God comes. And if you mix this with knowledge of the Kabbalah, early mysticism, there's a much different story going on in the Gospels. And not only do you realize that, whoa, this isn't a piece of journalism. This is like a really deeply Jewish text, more than we even realized. We're talking a whole different animal with a whole different set of rules and interpretations, and also meaning to it. So that's one. That's a really powerful one. And that same kind of language, like you mentioned, is the backdrop to Hebrews. Hebrews talks about these worlds, and the visible was created from the invisible. And over the years, for me to understand that, I would create graphics, and because I'm a graphic designer, marketing person by trade, and they really helped me. And that's kind of what I put on the website, because it's unlike anything we've seen, right? I think we still have kind of the Hellenistic mindset about heaven and earth, physical, body and soul. We kind of reduce these down to very simple terms, but the framework that the early Jewish mystics and the sages work from is very complex. And when you start to see these elements in the New Testament in perfect alignment with the way the sages and the Kabbalists use it, again, it's transformative. You realize we're in completely different territory. And we also have no idea what we're talking about in some of these passages because we didn't know that information. But once you know it, you move into new territory.
Right. Yeah. And I think we take it for granted, at least a lot of us, we just assume, or we don't understand that the language of the New Testament, it's not just the language of the New Testament. It's an actual, like, it's actually communicating an idea in a very specific way. Paul does this a lot, and we've talked about this before at the congregation I go to, that it's really interesting that Paul seems to use very mystical language for very simple concepts.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the Gentiles must have understood that to some extent, because I know I read it and I have to go straight into the Jewish sources to understand. So, because a lot of it is just a little bit beyond. But once you understand that, once you've actually been introduced, especially like to Kabbalah and stuff like that, it becomes obvious what Paul's trying to communicate. And like I've been reading the Tanya lately with someone, and it's really interesting. In the Tanya, a lot of that is just straight up Gospel of John, Epistle to the Romans, maybe even some of Hebrews also. Those are the three, if I could think of three books in the New Testament that seems to contain the most Midrashic tradition, that would be it. They have the like very mystical kind of ideas there.
I would say that John and Hebrews are some of the most reliant on the Kabbalah, early Kabbalah. I group it all together because it's generally the same, but for people who are sticklers about that, they're the most reliant on that. And it's interesting to me because John is often pitched as the book to the nations, but it's like a Trojan horse of these Kabbalistic ideas. And what I find fascinating is I like Midrash, but I think Midrash is a gateway. I say that because the Kabbalah is where you start to learn how to apply these things and kind of develop your soul, right? That's why the Tanya is so powerful. Amazing book. John's book seems very simple, but it's very Kabbalistic. And, I think that once, how does that happen? How does something so mystical get veiled and become part of normative American culture? I mean, people quote John all the time, but you have no idea like anything about what it is. They're not even religious. But I really think that this is, again, where the Kabbalah is fascinating to me. This is the seeding. This is the planting of the seeds so those concepts can be corrected at some point. And I think we're in the era where we're seeing these concepts corrected. I mean, you're able to get the Tanya. I read the Tanya. Like, people can find the Zohar. They're translated in English. I think we're in an era where, up until now, I don't know that anyone had the ability to see these connections and parallels like we do. We kind of take for granted that we can look at John and say, oh, it's Kabbalistic, because for most of the last 1800 years, 1900 years, it was a Christian book, right? For Gentiles. I mean, I think we can't take for granted that we're also in a very amazing time where we know that these methods of interpretation exist and we actually get to learn them. So.
Right. And I think it's important to say too on the channel that you and I are not saying that you can't understand like the gospel without these things. I think you and I both agree that you can understand the gospel. You can understand about Yeshua's message to the poor and all of that. You can understand that stuff without any of this. But to really understand the fullness of the New Testament, the significance of the role of Yeshua, the significance and even the trajectory that the New Testament took, and then also what was trying to be established in the early church, all of those things it's Midrash, oral tradition, all of that is vital to understanding it into the fullness. You just cannot appreciate the New Testament for what it really is without these things. But it doesn't detract from the simple, pure gospel message at all and belief in Yeshua.
Yeah, and that's really good to say that. I thank you for saying that. And at the end of the day, I don't think everyone should wade into these waters. I think, I have family members who are just content where they are. They'll have questions for me at times. I think that's fine. I think we're all on our own journey. But for example, just one that I just did a 2-part on my website because I think it's fascinating. Over the years, I've watched a lot of Gentiles argue about which Torah commandments to take on, and we should take all of them. No, we shouldn't take them. We should wear tzitzit. No, we shouldn't, right? And you see these really divisive arguments come up. And when you look at the context of Acts 15, I'm not the only one to say this. In fact, I've seen other people come to this conclusion. There's a book called Mishnat Rabbeinu covers this in the book. The apostles seem to me to be more interested in preserving the Gentiles' state of purity than assigning more commandments to them, because somehow they had connected with the divine presence, the Ruach HaKodesh, right? They had somehow received it. It was a mystery. Peter and the apostles seem to be really confused as to how that even happened, given the context and the discussions you can read in the Talmud about that time period, and idolatry. But nonetheless, they did. So the question wasn't about, number one, it wasn't about churches. They didn't exist yet. The question was, how do we preserve these Gentiles and let them be a part of the community without disabling everyone's ritual state of purity, right? And how do we enable them to be pure enough to maintain that divine presence? And none of the additional stipulations in Acts 15 are about commandments. Not that they couldn't, in that community, if the rabbi felt it was okay for them, not that they couldn't take them on. They probably did. It seems like in Colossians, they did take on new month, the Rosh Chodesh. They were doing Shabbat. Not that you can't, but the Acts 15 ruling really wasn't about that, right? And only if you understand kind of the background and the Midrash and the Sod level teachings can you kind of see what they were doing there. They're kind of using the Ger Toshav and the laws around the Ger Toshav, but they're doing something totally different that wasn't done. And I think that's why the New Testament is challenging to read and understand the historical and understand that it was all within Judaism of that time. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a sect that was supersessionistic. They were just simply working with the tools they had at the time, pre-Mishnah, pre-Talmud, to try to come to grips with this new reality they were in. And you're 100% allowed to do that in Judaism. So I think the consequences of not understanding it can be that it seems like there needs to be a new religion. Mm-hmm. But you can look at it and absolutely glean the ethics, the musar, the thou shall not, right? You can absolutely glean those and become a better person. I've seen it. It's happened to me. That's where I started. But I think that there becomes a time, and I had a friend recently cross this line. He said, I just don't know that I can grasp this anymore from just reading the Bible. I feel like I have to learn something else. Where can I go? Mm-hmm. Right. And it's not for everybody, but I'm glad you said that because it needed to be cleaned up.
Right. Yeah. I don't want anyone to take that the wrong way here. But yeah, I definitely was one of those people. And I love the quote from Rebbe Nachman that says knowledge supports faith when faith fails. And for me, learning this kind of stuff is the knowledge that's really supported my faith to understand. Because I think this it's one of the passions I have is to counter anti-missionaries. And I think this is one area they really attack. They attack Christians. They are very aware of the Midrashic stuff that's in the New Testament, but they know Christians aren't aware of that. So they try to trip you up on that. So it's something I'm really passionate about studying and sharing with other people. But like you said, it's not for everyone. And starting at the very basics, starting slow. You don't need to overwhelm anyone with Kabbalah or anything like that. But just learning stuff like this. Your book, again, this is Into the Orchard by James Ballard. I got this on Amazon. Is that mostly where you sell your book, or do you have it on the website too?
I linked to Amazon. Yeah, I just put it up there on Amazon, self-published.
Okay, yeah. So that book, this is a really good beginner book for someone who's wanting to enter into this idea of what is Midrash, what is oral tradition. It sounds kind of overwhelming. This is a really good beginner source. But do you have any other final thoughts before we close off?
I think just, for the people who are out there trying to navigate this space, it is challenging. Trust me. I think we've all been there. I think the the difficulty is that you will often find yourself alone asking these questions. And you may find that, and I found this as well. I have friends I've learned with and learn with in like the Orthodox community. They have boundaries. There's so much bad blood between the church and the synagogue that it's really challenging to carry these ideas across the boundary from one to the other. So you tend to find you need to have people who are, I don't know, open-minded, and they don't take things so personal, because that's what you're going to need to be able to find support as you continue to grow. I have people who very early on thought I was going way off the path, burning in hell forever. Right? It's just so much so that they couldn't make eye contact because they just didn't know what to do. But my life hasn't gone that way. It's been an incredibly rewarding journey. You change, you become a different person, you become more sensitive. I think you become more attuned to what's important in life. And for me, in my life, it's not converting people into different worldviews. If people want to argue, like, I'll answer as many questions as I can if it feels like it's going to be useful to them. But I'm not in a space anymore where I feel like that's my responsibility or my calling. And I'm thankful for people like Ray, right? You know, Ray's a warrior. He's a Beit Shammai. I'm kind of in more of a different position in my life right now. And I cherish those people who, even if we don't see anything or share any ideas, and they don't even have to be religious, but we can talk about these things openly. Those people become more valuable in times of need. Those are the people who I've found through this journey. And I don't know that I would have been so open-minded to that had I not left kind of the gates of organized religion myself, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. It's scary, but it is so rewarding. It is so rewarding. I think it's a danger when we become stagnant, really comfortable, because you can run the risk of becoming apathetic to a lot of things. And that's a huge problem. It's one of the things that Tanya talks about, is you need to always be in a continual process of growth. But right. So I really appreciate you coming on my channel. And I definitely want to plug, again, your website. It's thehiddenorchard.com. Is that correct?
That's it. Yep.
All right. Thehiddenorchard.com. Again, his book, I'll hold it up one more time. Into the Orchard. Let me get it right there. Into the Orchard by James Ballard. It's discussing the Midrashic tradition in the New Testament. If people wanted to contact you, what is the best way to get in touch? Just on your website, do you have like a contact form or something like that?
I do, yeah, and I welcome that. And if you can find me on Facebook as well, I have an account there. That's how we connected. So that works as well. Yeah, and I welcome that, because oftentimes people just want information about a book or a podcast or whatever. And I'm really glad to share what's been shared with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the channel, James. I really appreciate that. It's been a great conversation, and I hope everyone else really found this beneficial. Hopefully I can have you with Ray and Mitch on sometime all together to do like a part 2 follow-up. I think that would be really cool sometime.
Yeah, that would be fun. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Well, shalom, everyone. Hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in the next video.